Hello and welcome to Committee Corridor, the podcast from select committees at the House of Commons. I'm Toby Perkins, the Labour Member of Parliament for Chesterfield. I'm also the chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, and I'm delighted to be bringing you the latest episodes of our podcast. With the help of our guests, I'll be asking what happens when some of the UK's biggest issues meet our environmental targets and commitments head on. The expansion of aviation, a housing crisis, our water here in the United Kingdom, and our responsibility for the marine environments beyond our shores. And we'll end on the need for clean energy and how it's delivered. You might be asking, what is the Environmental Audit Committee? Well, the EAC, as it's known, look across government's work to check how it's squaring up to its own policies and the UK's ambitions for environmental protection. You can find out more about our work from an earlier episode of Committee Corridor, when the committee marked 25 years of environmental scrutiny with committee champions including former Prime Minister Theresa May. A third runway at London Heathrow. A second runway at Gatwick, expansion at Luton and upgrade to Leeds Bradford, and £30 million promised to support the reopening of Doncaster Sheffield Airport. The government's view is that unlocking airport capacity will boost economic growth. But what happens when the desire to deliver economic growth collides with the UK's net zero ambitions and desire to protect the environment? According to the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander MP, there is no conflict between expanding aviation and delivering on legal, climate and environmental obligations. They can exist side by side, she tells us. Climate campaigners say otherwise. They've launched judicial reviews to challenge the government's policy for achieving net zero aviation by 2050 and to halt the government's plans for expansion at Luton. The travel correspondent Simon Calder has spent decades at The Independent, where he has become a consumer champion for travellers. He can also take a longer view of developments in the industry. He joins me now. Simon, welcome to Committee Corridor. Help me set the scene. What is the demand for flying these days?
It's pretty much, Toby, back to where it was before the COVID pandemic. 2019, I think, will continue to be seen as really the high point for British travellers wishing to fly abroad. We had wider horizons, lower fares, greater safety than any year up until that point. And I remember at New Year's Day 2020, I posted on social media, 2019 was a great year, 2020 is going to be even better. Well, that went well. The aviation industry was traumatised, obviously, by the COVID pandemic, and we're still not back to where we were. Some individual airports, for instance, Manchester, are repeatedly hitting record numbers, and Heathrow looks set to do much the same. But elsewhere, particularly at the smaller regional airports, they're still struggling to catch up.
And in terms of the airport expansion, we've obviously referred already to some of the different projects the government has in mind. What kind of aviation expansion are we talking about? Is it domestic routes, business travel, long-haul flights, air freight? What do you see the expansion being led by?
Well, it is squarely demand by passengers to travel in and out of the UK. London remains absolutely the best connected city by air in the world, and Manchester catching up fast. We seem, as an island nation, to have an insatiable desire to get away by air, and you can do stuff with freight. So, for example, not far from your constituency, East Midlands Airport. Certainly not a passenger favourite, I'm sorry to say, but incredibly busy with lots and lots of freight. And of course the UK overall, and in particular England, has way too many airports for the size of the nation, and many of them are just vastly underused. So it's great to see that a pretty central airport like East Midlands with good motorway connections is being used for freight. That leaves all the more in-demand airports, and in particular Heathrow, to a lesser extent Gatwick, able to look after their happy passengers.
Conceivable to me that there's a more popular airport than East Midlands, but I'll take your word for it. The expansion in aviation signals thousands of new jobs, billions in economic benefits. To what extent should this be a cause for celebration?
Given your role in the Environmental Audit Committee, clearly you and I might take different views on this. I'll tell you my view, which is that international travel is a huge force for good. From a very selfish point of view, it enables us to see the world in a way that no previous generation has been able to do. And huge socio-economic benefits. As the UK, of course, becomes a more diverse society, it's more likely that we're going to have friends and family in different parts of the world, and it's great to be able to connect with them. Bringing in tourists is important, despite our efforts to frighten them away, and conversely, there is no better way than international tourism for richer countries to help less developed countries boost their economy. It's wonderful. Tourism to poorer parts of the world creates jobs, brings in hard currency, very labour intensive. It's a marvel, frankly.
I think from the perspective of the Environmental Audit Committee, we're right at the start of our review. And so we haven't got a view one way or the other. I think we are conscious of some of the concerns. We're also conscious of the commitments that have been made by government, and it will be our review looking into the extent those commitments can be made. But there's been widespread opposition from local residents and environmentalists. Can you summarise what the main concerns are?
Well, let's start at a very, very local level. And I'm going to take the example of the town of Crawley, where I was born, a couple of miles from the airport. And that is a place where, of course, it's had huge economic benefits from the airport, and actually it doesn't get very much noise, but what it does get is traffic, loads of it. And any airport is going to generate loads and loads of road traffic. And of course, all the airports will say we're doing everything we can to get people to travel by public transport, and actually, even though everybody loathes them and foreigners don't understand them, the fact that so many airports now have a charge for dropping off passengers is actually one component of moving people to public transport. So you've got all the traffic and the noise and the bad air that comes with that. While it is an unpopular thing to say, and you won't get much sympathy in, for example, Maidenhead or Richmond for saying so, aircraft are getting quieter and quieter. You're too young to remember Concorde, but I'm not. And that just used to deafen everybody. And all aircraft are getting quieter, so aircraft noise is becoming less of a problem. Of course, the wider concern is that carbon emissions are very significant with aviation. I think there's an awful lot of tosh talked by the aviation industry. Oh, it'll be fine. Hydrogen, electricity, it'll all be perfect. It won't. Things will get more efficient, but it's rather like nuclear fusion, the idea that all energy needs globally will be solved in 10 or 15 years, and then it just keeps being pushed back. And indeed, Airbus, who are, to their credit, doing a fair amount of useful stuff, have moved their plans 5 years later. Well, I can tell you exactly how to mitigate that impact, and that is partly taxation, if you do that rightly, in particular getting rid of people in the posh seats. Not getting rid of the people, they're lovely, they can stay, but getting rid of the posh seats, because a first class seat occupies maybe 10 times more real estate than an economy seat and involves huge amounts of weight.
I think you were right to say you might be getting some brickbats about your comments on the noise. I remember campaigning in Seema Malhotra's constituency during her by-election in 2012, and when a plane roared overhead, you literally had to stop talking to whoever you were for 20 seconds whilst it went. So it did seem sort of huge there. Now, what are the next steps for these proposals? The airports talk about being shovel-ready, but do you think this opposition is likely to scupper the government's plans?
Gatwick's plan, which is by far the cheaper and the more shrewd, is simply to say, look, we've got this standby runway, for goodness sake, can we just use it to allow takeoffs. And if we can do that, we can increase the capacity to the point where we're getting, and we're talking 15 years down the line here, we'd have almost as many passengers as Heathrow does now. And a lot of people are going to be thinking, oh no, that's the last thing we need. But it's us, the great citizens of Britain, who are triggering this demand. So that's a really nice idea, and keeping it all within the same airport footprint. That is really one heck of an achievement. Of course, it's going to put extra pressure on roads. You're going to need to do something serious about rail connectivity, but that will get you there. The Heathrow plans, which again the government's just said, go ahead, we will be minded to positively upon this if you can get it through. That's far more expensive, far messier. You are going to have a fifth terminal built. Looking at the footprint, it's going to be ridiculous. We've got at the moment this very, very concise rectangle that is the most productive aviation space in the world, where you're going to have to sort of build north and west out of there and have links and divert the M25 and all this malarkey. It's going to be incredibly messy. And I think Michael O'Leary, Chief Executive of Ryanair, which notably does not fly to Heathrow and never probably will, he said, well, I don't think it's going to happen until 2040, and I think he's absolutely right. Anybody who thinks we're going to get there by 2030 is, I'm afraid, deluded. You might see something in the early 2030s, but various other things you can do which are much lower hanging fruit.
Simon, you talk about the demand from the British public. The UK's Climate Change Committee says the best way to reduce the aviation sector's impact on climate change is to slow demand for flying. How can government square that circle? And do you see that as a realistic aspiration from the Climate Change Committee?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, the only significant change in taxation for aviation we have had in the last, I'm going to say since Gordon Brown probably, is exactly what Rishi Sunak ordered as Chancellor very cheekily on the, I think it was on the eve of COP26, just before he flew up in his private jet to say how marvellous and green the Conservative government was. No, he halved air passenger duty for UK domestic flights. The chief beneficiaries are people flying mostly on business between Edinburgh and London, a route on which LNER, a state-owned company, competes with two private companies, and yet aviation has been given a break. I mean, that is totally mad, but it shows the direction of political discourse. Yeah, I mean, you can, for a start, I'm absolutely against what has happened in France, where they have pretended to ban domestic flights where you can make the journey in 2.5 hours. They haven't. They've whatever they were trying to do, it hasn't worked. You want to go from Bordeaux to Paris, well, I'll give you 7 flights a day on Air France. But a good example of how a carrot is so much more effective than a stick is, for example, in the UK, just between Manchester and the two big Scottish cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, there used to be a significant number of flights, but now the West Coast Main Line, for all its faults, is actually so good that there's no justification for it. So build it and they will switch. But at the moment, well, it's that there is no evidence that anybody's going to do anything significant. What you absolutely need to do is start piling on the tax till, and I'm so sorry to sound like Dennis Healy, the pips squeak for the rich who are sitting in first class and causing disproportionately much more impact.
And 70% of the UK's flights are taken by 15% of the population. You talked about Rishi Sunak's tax changes. I mean, do you think that the way forward is to be about tackling frequent flyers rather than spoiling the family holiday?
No, I mean, you can do things with taxing frequent flyer plans, certainly, why not? Nobody has really tackled the question of, oh, OK, so I'm flying off to Mallorca in economy on Ryanair, or I'm going to fly first class to Australia, and that's going to count as my one flight of the year. It's ridiculous. Also, what do you do about foreign visitors? And If I feel, and my goodness me, I feel I fly more than most people, and if I think I'm going to be taxed to high heavens because I'm on my 10th flight this year, well, guess what? I'm going to be on the first ferry to Dublin and flying from there. So it won't actually do any good, or indeed catching the Eurostar to Paris. It would have all manner of unintended consequences, and I can't see that it would be doing things right.
The Environmental Audit Committee did our recent trip to the Netherlands by train, so we're purer than pure. But turning now to the issue of the economics of this, some argue that this expansion takes money out of the UK to spend elsewhere, potentially countries that are rejecting tourism, as many destinations struggle to cope with the growing number of tourists. To what extent is this an economic win for the UK, and to what extent is it actually seeing us spending more money overseas?
Well, first of all, we love going places which are even sunnier than Chesterfield and having lovely holidays, but also because we do not encourage inbound tourism anything like enough, and we are putting up barriers, whether it's saying, no, you can't come here to the UK with your nasty EU identity cards. That's 300 million people off the invite list then, because they are the number of EU citizens with ID cards but without passports. So we're doing everything we can to keep people out. 99.something% of all the world's destinations would love to have over-tourism as a problem, because inbound tourism is the closest anywhere can get to free money. People come in, they create jobs, they pay tax, they help fund amenities that simply wouldn't exist without tourism. So it's a huge force for good.
And one think tank, the ECIU, has reported that approving expansion at Gatwick and Luton would increase emissions to such an extent that it would wipe out the CO2 savings the government hopes to achieve from its clean power plan by 2050. Is you would referring to the sort of fanciful nature of what the aviation industry has spoken about earlier. Do you think it is likely that if this expansion goes ahead, that it will mean that we're just not serious about achieving the government's emissions targets?
Oh, look, I'm all in favour of people striving to meet targets, but I tell you what, 2050 is conveniently distant. And again, I'm going to have to duck for cover. It is absolutely preposterous that fuel, the tax on fuel is, I think, in real terms, about as low as it's been for the past 20 years. If you seriously want to cut emissions, go for road traffic and just put up that fuel levy, and then you will see some changed behaviours.
You're suggesting that we should be charging drivers a bit more to drive. That doesn't sound like an election-winning manifesto to this politician, but I understand your point that if the government wants to get serious about emissions, that's what it should be looking to. Now, the government is setting its store by the Jet Zero Task Force and Sustainable Aviation Fuel. It has created the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Mandate. Can you just talk us through what the government's plans are and what you think of them?
Well, I'm giggling slightly. I think they're rubbish. Sustainable aviation fuel. This is the idea that, for example, waste cooking oil or indeed agricultural crops can be used to create aviation fuel, which creates exactly the same emissions, but over the entire life cycle is less damaging. It's incredibly expensive. There's various mandates for airlines to use various amounts. They will get penalised. The report saying, well, yeah, you could see flights costing 40 quid more if we were to go ahead with this, but I tell you what, we won't. So, no, that's sustainable aviation fuel, I would say, is a fantastic get-rich-quick scheme for some shrewd people, but makes a tiny, almost immeasurable bit of difference. But anybody saying, oh, it's going to be fine, well, no, it definitely isn't, I'm afraid, if you're relying on sustainable aviation fuel.
It's really great to hear your experience, and it's been you've been an entertaining guest that I think will give people a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been really great to hear from you. Thank you to Simon Calder.
Toby, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for some great questions. I'm sorry about the answers.
No, we love them. Thanks, Simon. Here on Committee Corridors, several select committees have picked up the government's plans for scrutiny. The committee which I chair, Environmental Audit, has been asking how airport expansion will impact the UK's climate and nature goals. And immediately following the announcement of its support for a new runway at London Heathrow, the Transport Committee examined the effect of airport expansion on economic growth across the country. I'm joined now by Ruth Cadbury, the chair of the Transport Committee and a Labour Member of Parliament for Brentford and Isleworth. And I'm joined by Sarah Gibson, the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Chippenham, who sits with me on the Environmental Audit Committee. Ruth, Sarah, welcome to Committee Corridor.
Hello, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So let's start with this conundrum. Ruth, is it as simple as economic growth versus climate commitments?
The government did announce the third runway at Heathrow Airport on the basis that it did provide growth, but the evidence is not clear that there would be net economic growth to the UK with Heathrow expansion. There's other evidence that suggests that growing Heathrow would actually undermine growth in the regions and at regional airports. So there's quite a lot of evidence to say that.
Right, so you're questioning whether it would deliver economic growth. Do you think ultimately that can be achieved whilst being consistent with the government's climate commitments?
Well, I think that's a real challenge as well, because if all of the runway growth that even in the southeast alone was to go ahead, that would exceed the transport budget allocation, not only for aviation, but for transport as a whole. So that would mean other parts of the economy. If the carbon budget was to be kept to, it would mean that aviation is basically taking an awful lot of the load in terms of carbon emissions. And it wouldn't necessarily, as I say, deliver net growth to UK PLC. And given that an awful lot of the passenger demand is actually UK residents flying overseas for holidays and leisure, that actually, if you add the net tourism deficit onto the equation, then again, that impacts on what's good for the UK economy, particularly around the regions of this country.
Yeah, I mean, Simon Calder earlier was pouring cold water on those suggestions from climate campaigners. But what about you, Sarah? Do you think it's as simple as economic growth or climate commitments, or can the government have them both?
I think the government can have them both, very definitely, in terms of sustainable businesses, renewable energies, concentrating on the circular economy. I'm not convinced, as Ruth is not, that airport expansion is part of that equation. I really don't see how expanding aviation, which, as we know, transport is already one of our highest causes of carbon emissions in the UK, and aviation makes up a large part of that. And I don't see that expanding airports in the southeast definitely is going to make a difference to growth in the southeast. There might be a different argument to airports in the north, but we all know that carbon emissions through land-based transport, such as trains, is so much lower than people flying that it really needs to be thought again, I think.
So, Sarah, you were referring there to aviation representing 8% of the UK's emissions, making it the country's sixth highest emitting sector. The Climate Change Committee said that no airport expansion should proceed without a UK-wide plan to annually assess and control the sector's climate impact. But when we heard from the Climate Change Committee, they seemed to be much less certain that it couldn't be delivered in line with the government's commitments, although obviously they were non-committal. Do you feel that there is evidence that the sector is moving towards reducing their emissions sufficiently to allow expansion?
I can't see that they are. They seem to me to be relying on sort of future innovation. I mean, there's a lot of talk about sustainable aviation fuel, which hasn't really got to a point where it's commercially viable, so we can't be using it. And I don't think they're looking hard enough at the moment about the secondary effects of airport expansion. It's not just the aviation side of it, it's all the access to and from an airport, all the logistics that are involved in an already congested area. I mean, I live in the southwest, and yet Heathrow ought to be our closest and more sensible airport. You cannot get from Swindon, Bristol or Bath to Heathrow by train. You have to go into central London and back out again. So the result is that people drive. And again, that side of it doesn't seem to me to be on the front foot before we talk about expansion of an already congested airport.
Now, Sarah, Select Committee, the Environmental Audit, is starting public hearings on airport expansion and climate and nature targets. Very glad that Ruth Cadbury will be joining us on our committee for that review. We want to work out the environmental targets that ministers should ensure are met in advance of any announcement. What are the priorities for you in this Select Committee review? What do you really want to be hearing or scrutinising?
Oh, I'd really like to hear from the sector about the viabilities of such things as bans on short flights, which we know are hugely carbon heavy, and probably there's a more viable way around it. What would we need to do to encourage people to do that? Looking again at penalisation of private jets, the fact that first class travel is still VAT free. I think there are various things that we might be able to do to try and make sure that flying becomes the last option. And I would really like to see what people's thoughts are on trying to curb excessive use of flights when it's not necessary.
And what about you, Ruth? What are your priorities heading into this Select Committee hearings?
Well, I mean, just in terms of Sarah's points, I always prefer carrot to stick. I don't think we want to be opposed to a family on a low income taking one holiday a year to the sun, which they don't get a lot of in the UK. But the excessive growth in flying, particularly for UK residents, has been from higher income people taking 2, 3, 4 short breaks a year and going increasingly long distances. So, not the south of France, but the Maldives, for instance, is, massive growth to tourism there. And although, an increasing number of people, particularly young people, but still a minority, are making their travel choices on the basis of climate. But there's no doubt that aviation needs to pay its external environmental costs in a way that rail does. And yet rail, because rail is so much more expensive. But also, as I say, we started on the question of growth and, growth for whom and where. And so much of the growth planned or prospective growth in UK passenger numbers is around London and the southeast. And that doesn't really help the regions and many people in the far distant parts of the UK if they need to fly and if they can afford to fly if the ticket prices do go up, would far prefer to go point to point from their local regional airport than have to schlep all the way down to West London.
Sarah, a small amount of frequent flyers dominate air travel in the UK. Both you and Ruth referred to the frequency of flyers. Almost all the countries with high aviation emissions are dominated by a relatively small number of flyers. Now, Simon Calder talked earlier about government action to modify behaviour, but he seemed to dismiss the frequent flyer levy. Have you come across any examples internationally of good practice on this?
I haven't found any of the sort of heavy flying countries that are starting to do this, but I certainly think it would be something that would be worth asking our European neighbours, because I'm sure that the German government and probably the French government are also looking into issues around this. And it does seem to me that, again, just as with the Industrial Revolution side of it, the poorer nations are having to pay the price for the richer nations having profited. We are now looking at the fact that the poorer members of our own society are being penalised, as Ruth mentioned, for their one holiday abroad, where the richer side of the country are happily getting tax breaks for private jets and first-class flights. And I do think that a certain amount of cost where it's due would be sensible.
What tax breaks are you referring to?
So the fact that there's no VAT on travel also applies to private jets and first-class flights. And that always has struck me as being wrong.
OK. Now, Ruth, the evidence is that the public's appetite to fly is only going up. Simon pointed to changes in passenger duty as a way of improving travel choices. The UK already has one of the highest APD rates globally. Do you think it could be used in a smarter, more focused way, or what do you see as the best way of striking this balance between taxation and growth?
I don't have a strong view about particular mechanisms, though, if we could find some way of discouraging the very frequent flying, particularly for leisure purposes, without penalising a family on an average income. But the other is to build alternatives. So when the rail line from London to Manchester went ahead, the number of direct flights London Heathrow to Manchester went down by about 2/3, I think. We already have that opportunity through the Channel Tunnel, which is operating at 50% under capacity. That would take a few flights out of the air by ensuring that perhaps twice as many people could use that rail link than are currently doing so via Eurostar.
To make that viable, Ruth, we do need to look at the cost. I mean, for a long time, it was cheaper to fly from Cadiz to Barcelona than it was to get the high-speed train. And they sorted that problem by subsidising the train because it's a nationalised company. And that made all the difference to us flying long distance in Spain.
And you, Ruth, chair the Transport Select Committee. You were quick to hold a session after the government's decision to expand London Heathrow. The committee wanted to test if airport expansion would drive regional economic growth across the country. What did you learn?
As I say, the jury's out on whether expanding Heathrow does actually provide total net growth in the UK or just shifts growth again, yet more growth from the regions into London and the southeast. And certainly Heathrow in West London is in the second highest growth area by GVA in the UK already. The figures by which Heathrow were justifying expansion were deep in a report that Heathrow has not yet released, and we did ask them to release it. Whereas some of the other figures about demand and costs and economic implications were quite well set out by several of our witnesses.
Yeah, now, nationally significant infrastructure projects such as airport expansion require a national policy statement. This is where government sets out its policy, the reasoning behind it, and detailed planning guidance, including how they will handle the impact of the scheme. The last time expansion at Heathrow was discussed, the Transport Select Committee handled it. Are you expecting the national policy statement to come your way this time?
As you say, all national policy statements are required to be looked at by Parliament. If Heathrow bring forward a proposal for runway 3, which is a big if at the moment because there seems to be some doubt that they can afford it, but if they do, there will be a national policy statement. It would go actually to liaison committee to decide which committee would then address that policy statement. But I think there's a fair chance that it would be Transport Committee looking at it. But we would certainly be happy to have advice or support from your committee, Toby, in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And my final question to you both is about taking part in select committee work. Committees obviously are cross-party groups. The ambition is to leave our political views and loyalties outside the door when we pick up an inquiry and consider simply the evidence that we've heard. Airport expansion is a tricky one. If you, like yourself, Ruth, you have an airport in your backyard, or strong party lines to follow as you do, Sarah, with the Liberal Democrats. Ruth is a long-standing select committee member and parliamentarian. Sarah, much newer to Parliament, having been elected this time. How does it feel being on a select committee, Sarah? What's your sense as to how you balance the evidence that you are hearing and that party line that you need to follow outside of the Select Committee?
As you said, I am new to this whole process, but I have found working on the Select Committee as being one of the most rewarding parts of my Westminster side of the job, in that it's the one space where I feel as if we are really concentrating on an issue. We're working collegiately together. I've seen some very nice cross-party support from across the committee, and some very serious holding to account of ministers by everybody, not just by the opposition, on our committee. And I felt that we are very much working together to get to a common ground and a common view. And that's been hugely rewarding from my perspective. And it's a moment where one gets to question the policies of one's own party, and to make sure that they are robust. If there's anywhere where party policy needs to be reviewed, it is following these kind of interviews. So I am finding it very rewarding.
Excellent, that's good to hear. And what about you, Ruth, as the newly ensconced chair of the Transport Select Committee? Obviously, you have your own constituency views on airport expansion. How are you able to manage that balance between what your constituents might want to hear and the evidence base you listen to?
I've also really enjoyed being on 3 select committees in my 10 years in Parliament. And you make a good point, but being able to bring out the issues from all perspectives and get on public record the depth of an issue. So, I certainly wasn't going to set up an inquiry that was going to be one-sided. I'd have definitely been caught out on that. We gave Heathrow Airport and the airlines the opportunity to explain in detail the case for expansion and questioned expansion. Whether it's Heathrow expansion or airport expansion, it's interesting that the divides are not necessarily on party lines. And certainly the vote last time Heathrow expansion came to the House, as I say, there were very different views in all the political parties, I think.
Well, Ruth Cadbury, Sarah Gibson, thank you so much for joining me, and great to hear your views. And we will very much look forward to hearing the evidence that both the Environmental Audit Committee and indeed the Transport Committee here on this issue, which no doubt will run and run. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The EAC inquiry will be hearing evidence in public over the next months. Find out who we're talking to and when from our web pages on UK Parliament and our social media content in all the usual spots. You can also watch on parliamentlive.tv or come and join us in the public gallery. You'll be very welcome. My thanks to all my guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for tuning in and sticking with us. Next time on Committee Corridor, we'll be asking how we meet the urgent need for housing in the UK today while keeping the commitments to net zero in our sights. You can find all our previous episodes of this podcast by searching UK Parliament plus Committee Corridor. Please like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. I'm Toby Perkins, and this has been Committee Corridor. Thank you for listening.